This is Sarah, and I'm here with Richard Capriola, and he has more than 20 years experience in mental health and substance abuse, specializing in teens. I know so many people are like, oh, what teens, like what are they doing? Why are they thinking this way? And it can be really terrifying when someone you love and someone you care about is starting to exhibit some dangerous choices and behavior. So Richard is here to help us with that. How are you, Richard?
I'm doing great, Sarah. Thank you so much for inviting me to spend some time with you to talk about this topic of adolescent substance abuse. I think it's a very important issue, and I think it's an issue that um, uh, parents can gain a lot of information from. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, you are so welcome. So you wrote The Addicted Child, right? Tell us a little bit about that book.
Well, I wrote the book after I retired from Menninger Clinic in Houston, where I worked for over a decade with adolescents and adults diagnosed with both mental health and substance abuse issues. And so many times when I would sit across from a parent and I would explain their child's history of using a substance, what drugs they were using, how often they had been using, and for how long, and I would give them the diagnosis of a substance use disorder, they would look at me and they would say, I had no idea this was going on. Or if they did suspect their child was using a substance, they would say something like, well, I sort of suspected something was going on, but I didn't know it was this bad. So after I left Menninger, I wanted to put together this resource for parents. It only runs about 100 pages. I wanted it to be non-technical. I wanted it to cover basic information like warning signs, an explanation of how drugs work in the teen brain, what type of assessments are important if you want a diagnosis, what a good treatment program looks like, and resources that are available. Because I wanted parents to have this information, have this knowledge, because knowledge is power, and to not be so afraid of this subject, not be so paranoid about it. So hopefully in reading this short book, parents will feel more confident, walk away thinking, okay, I've got this, I feel better prepared, I can handle this if I need to, and just be better prepared to deal with the issue and more knowledgeable about it. That's my goal.
And one of the things that you talk about is how to communicate with teens if they have this issue, which I know will be of great interest to our listeners and your readers.
Yeah. I'm often asked, well, what's the first thing I should do when I suspect my child is using a substance like alcohol or maybe marijuana or a drug? And I say the first thing to do is have a discussion with your child. Sit down and talk about what you're observing and what you're seeing. And by discussion, I mean this is not an inquisition. This is not where you accuse your child of doing anything or you threaten them. This is coming from a standpoint of being curious. So you, when we talk to each other, even as adults, we're very good at listening to each other's words, but sometimes we're not so good at listening to the feelings that are behind those words. So that when we're talking to our child, we hear what they're saying, we hear the words, but we often don't tune into the feelings that are behind those words. And that's a skill that every parent can learn and every parent can practice, so that when we're talking to our child, we're tuning into their feelings as well as their words. So with this initial conversation, you want to approach it from the standpoint of being curious. I'm seeing this behavior and I'm wondering if you can help me understand it. I'm seeing you do these things and I want you to help me understand why this is going on. So that's a discussion that I think has the potential to be more productive, because the child will feel that you're just not accusing them of anything. You're listening to them, you're tuning into their feelings. That's a discussion that's likely to go one of two ways. It's either going to blow up and the child will become argumentative and defensive, or you might learn some things about the child. But regardless of how that first discussion goes or the second discussion, the next step would be, if you're still concerned, to get the assessments done so that you can get a diagnosis.
So, what are some early warning signs that parents should watch out for that tells them they need to have that curious conversation?
In my book, I have warning signs on a child that might be using alcohol. I have different warning signs on a child that might be using marijuana. There are warning signs for a child that might be developing an eating disorder or who might be self-harming themselves, because sometimes um, these things like an eating disorder and self-injury can accompany a child's using alcohol and drugs. So I put those warning signs in there as well. As a general rule, what I advise parents to do is pay attention to the changes that you see in your child. You know your child better than anyone. So pay attention to these changes that you see. Don't assume that they're just normal adolescent acting out. They may very well be, but they may also be an indicator that there's something else going on underneath the surface. So, for example, you might have a child who was earning very good grades and now the grades are starting to decline. You might
Mhm.
have a child that used to enjoy participating in sports, no longer wants to participate in sports. You may have a child who was very social and outgoing and communicating, now becomes very isolating and quiet. You may have a child who very readily introduced you to their friends. You knew who their friends were. You might have even known who their parents were. Now becomes very secretive of who their friends are. So these are warning signs that parents need to pick up on. Now, if these warning signs last a day or two or they're very infrequent, that's probably not concerning. But if they start to linger over a period of time and you start to see more of these warning signs, not just one or two, but now you're starting to see a pattern of warning signs, then I think it's time to get concerned.
So, how do parents know the difference? There's such a almost like a rite to passage conversation within teens and abuse of alcohol or whatever. Because I mean, I guess if it's a legal drug, it's always an abuse of that. And then if it's alcohol and it's before 21, that's an abuse of that. But when you think about seeing movies about college kids, it's almost a standard of behavior that people are blacked out drunk. What, as parents, what should we know that we don't know about allowing kids to experiment with drugs and alcohol?
That is very dangerous and very risky. And I think what's important, and it's why I have a chapter in my book on the neuroscience of addiction, because what's important is to recognize that the teenage brain is in the process of maturing and developing. Our brains don't get fully developed until we're around age 24 or 25. So it's very important that we do everything we can to protect that teenage brain. It's in the process of maturing and developing and forming circuits that will later benefit that child as an adult. So it's very important that that developing brain be protected. And things like alcohol and marijuana and even the other illicit drugs can do some real damage to that child's developing brain. So this is not something that you want to gamble with or take a chance with. As a parent, we need to do everything we can to protect our child's brain.
And I'm going to zero in on this a little bit more. So, are you saying that it is dangerous? And I know this may seem like a silly question to you, but I just hear so much of this, and it's like, oh, but boys will be boys. Everybody's going to experiment. So, what you're saying is letting your kid drink, like say, well, they're drinking at home, so it's not dangerous to them because I'm watching it and they're not out driving. It still has issues with that teen's brain.
The research will tell you that if you are a parent who allows their child to drink alcohol at home, that child, when they get to college, will end up drinking even more than if you had discouraged it while they were home. It actually increases the likelihood that that child in college will do even more binge drinking than if you had discouraged it while you were at home. Teenagers take their cues from parents and from grandparents and aunts and uncles. So it's very important that family members send a strong message that any type of use of substances is very much discouraged.
Well, I will send a thank you note to my parents. They were very against that. They didn't even drink as adults,
Good
definitely.
for them. Good for them.
Yeah, I'll send this to my dad. No, just kidding. Probably not. He watches most of my stuff anyway. But it is. It was someone and I were talking, discussing our college experiences yesterday, actually, and they were talking about parties and this blackout drunk experience. I was like, I did not have those experiences, right? I was really worried about what it would do to me. And I was really grateful that, because especially with females, you hear so many horror stories of like
Yeah.
drinking, something bad happening. And I'm just, I have great compassion to people that did happen to. And I'm not victim shaming that because you were drinking, someone got the right to do with your body or whatever. That's not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But I am grateful that that is not an experience I've had. I've had some other really terrible experiences, but not that one.
Yeah.
So anything else that you think is common practice or common knowledge among parenting that people should know that is actually dangerous?
I think the big focus, because many parents are not aware of it, is the brain development and how risky these drugs can be to their child's brain. An example that I would give you is that when I was working at Menninger Clinic in the adolescent unit, I met many young men and women who were smoking marijuana, and they were smoking a lot of marijuana, often multiple times a day. And they were very bright. Their IQs were above average to superior. But when the psychological test came back, I noticed that the processing speed of their brain was below average, and their short-term memory was impaired, and their motivation was significantly reduced. So that's an indicator that these drugs have an impact on the brain, particularly the adolescent developing brain. So if there's one message that I would send to parents is protect your child's brain, recognizing that these substances at a very young age in adolescence can do some really damage to your child's developing brain.
Do you think we should raise the drinking age to 25?
I don't think that that's going to happen, but if we tied everything to the brain development and the neuroscience, that would make a lot of sense. But I don't think that society is ready for that, and I don't think adults are ready for that either. So the best
The lobbyist, yeah.
So the best we can do as parents is just recognize that we ought to keep these things away from our children as long as we can. And also to spend time, especially as our children get a little older, spend some time educating them about the importance of their brain. When I was working with teenagers, it didn't do me any good to tell them that the drugs were illegal. It didn't do me any good to tell them if they kept smoking marijuana, their grades were going to decline. They might not graduate. They might not get to college. They might not get a job. They didn't care about any of that because they didn't believe it. But what did capture their attention was the neuroscience. When I could talk to them about their brain and I could show them different areas of the brain and what they were responsible for, and then I could show them where marijuana affected those different areas of the brain, they were interested in that. That captured their attention because they could see and understand. Now I know why my short-term memory isn't as good as it used to be. Now I know why my motivation isn't what it used to be. So they were very much interested in the science behind this, and that's something that parents can use to capture their child's attention. It's also something the schools can focus on too, but they rarely do.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And my first thought is if someone can say it even other than the parent, like a favorite aunt or a favorite uncle or
Yeah.
someone that there's not as much pressure from. I'm not sure what your experience has been, but it seems to go down a little easier when it's not mom and dad sometimes. Even
Oh,
that's not an excuse to avoid the conversation, but to enhance the conversation.
absolutely. And many times grandparents and aunts and uncles can have a tremendous influence on their child. So those are all resources that parents can marshal to help them so that they're not doing this by themselves. They have a support system. They have other members of the family that are tuning in. And hopefully everybody's sending the same message to the child, just in different ways.
Yeah, that's great. So I know there's a link to, because you talked about mental illness and substance abuse. Can
Yeah.
you talk a bit on that pairing and why it often goes together?
Many times, a child who's using a substance will be using that substance to medicate an underlying issue. Not in all cases, but in some cases, and that's the reason why I recommend that you get a comprehensive assessment, not just focus on the alcohol and drugs, but investigate whether or not there's an underlying issue. When I ask teenagers to help me understand why they're smoking marijuana, the number one answer that came back was, it helps me with my anxiety. It reduces my anxiety. So that's an indication that for some kids, certainly not all kids, but some kids will be using a substance to medicate an underlying mental health issue. It might be anxiety, it might be depression. In some cases, it might be trauma. It
Mhm.
might be being bullied at school. It could be an emerging personality disorder. It could be depression. And as a parent, what you want to know is rule in or rule out whether or not any of those issues are affecting my child. Because if you find that they are, then that's going to have to be treated as well. You can't just treat the marijuana and not treat the anxiety. So if a
Mhm.
child is smoking marijuana to reduce their anxiety, you need to treat both. So as a parent, you want to either rule in or rule out whether or not there's any of these mental health issues that might be contributing to your child's using a substance.
And what tips do you have for parents needing to get past that barrier of seeing what is rather than what they wish
I think that
was?
that focuses on the professional assessments. They will give you the objective look at your child. As a
Mhm.
parent, sure, you're going to be a little bit biased. We all are as parents, and none of us want to assume or even think that our child might be using an illicit drug. So
Mhm.
the purpose of the comprehensive assessment is to get the professional input, get the professional diagnosis, as well as the treatment plan if it's needed, and recommendations. We all have our own bias, particularly towards our children. So if you're concerned, you need to get that unbiased professional review of your child and recommendations. And that way, you won't feel so alone that you're the only one that's making the assessment. You need to get those professional views as well.
And if I was trying to figure out how to, my children are not at an age where they would be, my biological children are not at the age where they would be experimenting with anything. So I'm trying to imagine like going and like fast forwarding 10 years and like, oh, how could this be that, and putting myself in that situation. And I think it's the long-term dangers, if it's not addressed, that would really motivate me into action and motivate me out of denial. Is that typically the best strategy? Or how do you not let it get so bad that you have to see it?
Well, I think unfortunately, in some cases, it does get so bad that you're sort of put into a corner and you feel like you're desperate. The parents that I worked with who were sending their child to Menninger Clinic, which is a psychiatric hospital, the situation had gotten to the point where they felt that they had no other option. It had gotten that severe. The consequences had become so destructive, so catastrophic, that they had to hospitalize their child. And you don't want to wait till it gets to that point. So the
Mhm.
sooner you pick up on these warning signs, and the sooner you get these assessments and get these professional diagnoses, and the sooner you get a treatment plan, that means that you can address this issue a lot sooner. Because if it is an issue, the longer you delay dealing with it, the more likely the consequences are going to become more severe and treatment will become more difficult. So the sooner is the better.
I think if I could change one thing about the human population, it would be that, we always, obviously with addiction, it's like that term of hitting rock bottom. And it's like, oh, once I get stage 4 cancer, I'll go to the doctor, and if I could change anything about, and I've done it myself, I'm not pointing judgment here. But now I try not to. Yeah, I try to hit things earlier, and with my clients, I help. Let's take care of it earlier.
Sure.
Um, it changed so many things about humans, right? If we could just act earlier.
If we could just see the warning signs, first of all, earlier, because a lot of us miss the warning signs or we ignore them for a long period of time until it becomes much more serious. So, the key is, first of all, to know the warning signs. Even if it's a medical diagnosis, know what the warning signs are. If you're developing an ulcer, know what the warning signs are. So knowing what to look for, I think, is a big component. And then when you notice those warning signs, to act as quickly as you can to get the professional assessment done so that you know how serious the situation is and what the course of treatment will be. The sooner is better.
I'll show you my book. So it's got this huge red flag like popping out of this hole.
I like
Like,
that.
pay attention to me. It's not about the warning signs necessarily you're talking about, but it is about recognizing warning signs in relationships.
Yeah, that big red flags is exactly what it is. It should be a big red flag that pops up for parents so that it sort of says, "Hey, take a moment here and let's look at this. We don't want to ignore this."
Yeah. So let's talk about the conversation of anger. And I don't know if that's specifically addressed in your book, but when I'm talking to I have a lot of ladies who have kids in their late teens. And how do we know what is kind of normal teenage anger versus it being a huge red flag popping up?
Well, anger is anger. Anger is a normal human emotion. Teenagers are not exempt from it. They're going to have it. And I think what we focus on is the consequences of that anger. Most teenagers, very rarely know how to appropriately deal with their anger. They tend to lash out. A lot of adults do the same thing. We're not much different. So I think as a parent, first of all, recognize that anger is just an emotion. Your child is going to become angry. They're going to become angry over maybe some of the rules that you have. They may become angry because of something that happened in school. A lot of reasons why they can be angry. And as a parent, you don't want to shut that anger down. You don't want to send the message that it's a bad thing because it's just a human emotion. As a parent, what you want to do, hopefully, is be able to get back to that conversation style that I talked to earlier, where you're coming from an inquiring position. You're noticing the anger. You're curious as to what's bringing it about, but you don't want to shut it down. You don't want to tell them not to be angry. You want to observe the anger and see if you can have a conversation where they're likely to open up and talk to you about what's behind that anger. If they know, they may not. But the best you can do is try to open that conversation to learn as much as you can about what's behind the anger. Now, obviously, if the anger becomes destructive or violent, then you need to intervene right away to put that down and send the message that that's not acceptable. But if they're angry because they got a poor grade at school, they got angry because some girl or some guy didn't respond to them, or they ask somebody out and they get rejected, sure, they're going to feel angry. So there's different ways to deal with it depending on the circumstances. But what you want to do is hopefully have that conversation where they will share what's behind that anger, because really that's what you're after. You're after what's driving this anger, what's behind it, what's really going on underneath the surface.
And if there was some type of withdrawal anger or some anger attached to substance abuse, would that look different than what you're being able to talk about, kind of just normal human anger that there's feelings behind?
Well, it still would be anger, but it would be anger because the child is withdrawing from a substance, which makes them very irritable, very edgy, very angry, very reactive. And again, your goal is to see if you can find out what's underneath it. Is this anger I'm seeing because of withdrawal? May very well be, or is it because something that they're really angry about that happened outside of substance abuse?
Yeah, yeah. So how do we identify effective treatment?
Well, effective treatment gets back again to the assessment and the diagnosis. If you have a child whose assessment shows that there's an underlying mental health issue, that's going to lead to a treatment plan that focuses on that underlying mental health issue. So everything goes back to the assessment, which goes back to the diagnosis, which leads to the treatment plan. So you have the assessment, and then you have the diagnosis, which tells you what's going on, and then you have the treatment plan, which is specific to the diagnosis. And depending upon what your child is dealing with and whether there is or isn't an underlying mental health issue, that's going to direct the treatment plan. And the treatment plan is going to give you advice in terms of what types of treatment do you need. There is no one treatment fits all children. Some children will do very well in an outpatient program where they may see somebody maybe once a week. Other children might need what's called an intensive outpatient program where they'll see somebody several times a week. And then for some children where the underlying issues or the substance abuse is so severe, they may be looking at a residential treatment program, which could last weeks or months. But that's generally when either there's a severe underlying psychological issue or the substance abuse has really gotten severe. It's in the severe category. Those children may be looking at a residential treatment. But a lot of children can do very well in an outpatient treatment program where they're seeing somebody, over a period of time, maybe once or twice a week.
So I'm curious, the assessment to figure out which treatment plan they need.
Yeah.
Teens, especially teens who may be struggling with addiction, are pretty good liars, as well as some adults are very good liars. I don't mean to paint teens, but what are some sample questions, or how do they know that the teen is telling the truth? Because I think it would be easy to be like, I'm fine. No, I don't get angry. No, I don't do this. No, I don't have an issue with this.
Oh yeah, I've dealt with teens that have been just like that when it comes to substance abuse. I'm not using that much. It's no big deal. And a professional who is working with teenagers knows that this is not uncommon. They know what they're walking into, and they rely on their communication and their empathy and their skills to be able to eventually move that child from, say, a denial stage where they deny everything to a more contemplation stage where they're willing to look at the issues. That takes a little bit of time. It's certainly not going to happen, or very rarely happens, after just one or two meetings. But I think as a parent, what you do is you rely on the professionals to deal with this issue, whether it's getting you the assessment or giving you the diagnosis or giving you the treatment plan, or to actually do the treatment. You rely on the professionals to be able to develop that relationship with your child where they will eventually open up and begin to make some progress. That's not going to happen real quick because most teenagers don't want to be in treatment or do any assessments. But if you're patient and you're with the right professionals and you give it enough time, you can be surprised at the remarkable progress that you can see. It's pretty remarkable.
So hopeful. That's so hopeful. Thank you so much. Well, I want you to tell people about your book, but then you also have a workbook that helps parents, if they are struggling with this issue, helps parents emotionally deal with it, which I think would be very interesting to my listeners. So give us some ideas about both.
Okay, the workbook I wrote because so many times parents are left out there alone to deal with this, and they have their own emotions. They may be questioning, what kind of a parent am I? How did I miss the warning signs? What did I do wrong? So they're going through their own sort of set of emotions. A lot of the attention's focused on the child, and we often neglect that the parent's struggling as well, if not more. So I put together this very brief workbook to help them go through these emotions and to talk about how this is affecting them and how it's affecting their family. It has them write a letter to their child explaining how they're feeling. It has some examples of how to deal with anxiety, and it has some examples of how to deal with this communication that I was talking about, focusing on on feelings, not just words. That's all in the parent workbook. The main book itself is meant to be an education tool to help you become better informed about substance abuse in adolescence, not become paranoid about it, but become better educated and better informed, and to feel as if you are better prepared to deal with this issue if it comes up. Now, those are all available on Amazon. The name of the book is The Addicted Child, A Parent's Guide to Adolescent Substance Abuse. You can also go to the book's website, which is www.helptheaddictedchild.com, helptheaddictedchild.com. You can read endorsements, you can read book reviews, you can read a sample of the book. There'll be a link that will take you directly to Amazon where you can order either the book or the parent workbook. And there's a link where you can send me a message or ask me a question as well. So one of the easiest ways is just to go to helptheaddictedchild.com.
And Richard and I already discussed that we're sure my listeners are going to have some questions. We're going to have him back on to answer some of those because it's such an important topic when we're talking about.
Yeah, please, if anybody has any questions or if there's an issue that I didn't get to in our discussion, please send them in and I'll be glad to come back and have another discussion where we can talk about those issues.
Yeah, that's awesome. So Richard, if you had one message, you had 1 minute, you could broadcast to anyone in the entire world, one message that you think everyone should know, what would your message be?
Don't give up hope that regardless of what your child is going through, regardless of the substance that they're using, regardless of how severe it is, there are effective treatment programs out there for you. And there are professionals that can help not only your child, but your family. And you can see some pretty remarkable improvement once you get on top of this and you begin to get the treatment for not only your child, but also yourself. And that's another thing, if you're a parent struggling with this, please get some help for yourself. It might be a friend, it might be another family member, it might be a counselor, whomever you have out there that can support and help you so that you don't feel so alone. But there is help for both your child and for you as well.
Well, check out his book, The Addicted Child. And thank you so much, Richard, for coming here and helping us on our journey to becoming toxic person proof.
It's been great. Thank you so much, Sarah, for having me as a guest on your program.